Welcome to this series of online discussions on adoption issues. I'd like to acknowledge children who went through private and public forms of out-of-home care, private being the adoption system, and public meaning foster homes and institutions. Many of those children had to live through challenges that most of us will never fully understand. Although outcomes of homelessness, addiction, and mental health issues have been studied and have been recognized in public types of out-of-home care, it is not so much the case in adoption. In adoption, there are positive and negative outcomes, but it's not just that black and white. In the following discussion, we will try to understand the root causes of substance abuse and suicidal behavior through the experiences of some adoptees, and propose ways to better care for children. The adoptees selected today do not reflect the diversity of experiences, but do represent experiences that aren't discussed in mainstream media. For the adopted people struggling with similar issues and who are listening today, I would suggest seeking for professional counseling in your specific region. I would like to start by introducing COLEEN CLARE, Adoptive Parent and Manager at VANISH, the Victorian Adoption Network for Information and Self-Help. Welcome, COLEEN.
Thank you, Pascal. It's good to be here, and I'll wait till you've introduced everybody.
Great, thank you, COLEEN. COLEEN doesn't have a camera, so we'll just be having her voice today. I'd like to introduce TANIA CURLIS, local adoptee.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. We have ISABELL Collins, also local adoptee.
Hi, Pascal. Hello, everyone.
Ron MCLAY, Intercountry Adoptee.
Hello, everyone. Pleased to be here.
Ron won't have a camera as well, so we'll just hear his voice. And finally, but not least, DOMINIC Golding, Intercountry Adoptee. Welcome, DOMINIC.
G'day.
I'd like to first start with a question. Let's start with Ron. What do we know about the connection between adoption and suicide?
Well, I can speak experientially. I'm 53 now, and I attempted suicide myself for the first time when I was 15 years of age. I attempted to drown myself, and then as my life progressed, there was numerous other attempts involving drugs or involving attempted cutting my wrist, trying to hang myself, etc., etc. So, now from my own experience, there is a very direct connection between my adoption and suicide. On the other hand, from other people's experiences, I've been going into jails now for just over 10 years to conduct meetings for people who've got drug and alcohol issues. And I disproportionately meet adoptees in the jails. And it's, as I've listened to them share, many of them have had stories of attempted suicide as well. So for me, there's a very, very direct connection between suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and adoption. My adoptive friends that I have here in Sydney, most of them seem to have, at some stage in their life, contemplated suicide or maybe made an attempt themselves. So I probably find it hard to find adoptees that haven't thought about it or attempted it. And I'm not saying that that's only because they're adopted, because of course people who aren't adopted have suicidal ideation as well.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, for sharing your experience. Isabel, did you ever notice any connection between adoption and suicide? What do we know about it?
Well, I'm not sure about here in Australia, but I've worked for the last 20 years in mental health, and my first 12 months I was involved in an inquiry into the standards of treatment and care in psychiatric institutions in Victoria. And in that 12 months I met more adoptees than I'd actually met in my whole life. And throughout my 20 years as an advocate, I certainly noticed that this seemed to be more than usual. And I don't think we've done any research here in Australia on suicide rates of adoptees, but I understand that overseas research has indicated that in some instances, I think in an American study, they found that suicide rates were 4 times higher, or attempted suicide rates, and other studies have supported that. The difficulty in Australia is that most suicides go to the coroners, but the coroners don't receive funding from government to do what they call a psychological autopsy, which would mean doing a psychological profile of the person who has suicided. And I think if we did that, we might find that there are compared to others that the suicide rate might be high. Certainly, my experience is when the advocacy, like I was the director of a statewide advocacy service, and when other advocates went out and they were advocating for somebody and they mentioned that they were adopted, they would say to them, look, our director is adopted. And what would happen is those people would actually want to talk to me. And I think that, and it was about, how they were feeling and things like that. But as I say, I don't think we've done anything in Australia. I think that's a tragedy. Often I think clinicians are fairly ignorant about the impact of adoption on adoptees. They assume that because you may have been raised in a loving household, that the adoption isn't an issue. And I think most adoptees know that the issues that you experience and the painful feelings actually has nothing to do with whether you were raised in a loving household or not. So that's been my experience.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I'd like to read out this article that I found in The Age in 1993, where a Jesuit priest, Brother Alex McDonald, who was working with homeless youth in St Kilda in Melbourne, noted that from 147 suicides he's seen, 142 had adoption backgrounds. So this rate of more than 95% of said cases raises question not only about the prevalence of suicide amongst these adopted people, but also what factors drove them to homelessness. I'd like to ask if anyone had any comments or perhaps ideas on what's the root that brings an adopted person to become homeless or perhaps feel suicidal tendencies. COLEEN, we would like to answer this question. So sorry, we have COLEEN's microphone muted. There we go. COLEEN.
I was just going to follow on from, first of all, I wanted to acknowledge Ron's experience and his courage in talking about it and working in the area, because that's so helpful. And then following on from what Isabel said, there has been some work in Australia by Susan Geer and some that we can pick up in the work of the Institute of Family Studies and the Senate inquiry that certainly indicate that the prevalence of suicidal tendencies in people who've been adopted are much higher than the norm. And I think when we look at our work here in Victoria over 26 years, it's clear that there is a cohort of people who are fine, maybe all their circumstances conspire for them to manage, but by and large the fact of not being with the parents that you were born to does occasion sorrow, loss and trauma, and then when that's compounded by what life offers for you and how you fit with your adoptive parents and what other things happen, the burden often becomes just too heavy to deal with what life offers, as well as that not knowing one's true identity and that constant wondering about why was I given away and about who might I have been I mean, most people don't have to cope with the thought that there's a parallel life out there that could have been theirs. So I think it's the confluence of circumstance and personality with the adoptive experience that certainly leads to a greater tendency to addiction and to suicide. And we don't know the real figures because a lot of them are quiet and a lot of them are hidden, and we don't have the in-depth studies. And then also there's suicide by road accident or by foolhardy behaviour. And I think we recently, I mean, Isabel is exceptional in her work, but we recently spoke to one of the largest providers of mental health in the state of Victoria, and they didn't have adoption on their radar. It simply was not on their radar in any way whatsoever. And when I talked about what we knew and what the Senate inquiry in the Institute of Family Studies and Susan Gare's research was indicating, they were pretty appalled and pretty taken aback, and I think they will take it forward. But I don't think there is any doubt that shaking of one's fundamental identity puts one in a very vulnerable position, particularly if other things go wrong. And it takes a lot of courage and a lot of support to come through that with the resilience that so many adopted people do show.
Thank you, Colleen. Is there a reason why is there resistance for publishing or doing those research?
I think that generally you find in society a belief that if you have a baby or a family that's vulnerable and you have somebody who wants that baby and they're prepared to love them, then there's a great tendency to want to think that's the perfect solution. We saw that in the past with the secrecy. Now I think we see it just as much, but with not so much secrecy. There's an unwillingness to admit that in fact you are taking, I'll use the word advisedly, taking a baby who has suffered a trauma and will be vulnerable and will have thoughts about their identity. I think people just don't want to face up to the fact that their easy solution is not as easy as they think, that it's very complex and very hurtful and that it needs a lot of support. And there's a reluctance for people to want to believe that because it kind of shakes the whole foundations of the out-of-home care system. Once you acknowledge that, then you need a lot more resources and a lot more support, and people have proved themselves unwilling to put that support in. At the moment, across Australia, resources are going into helping people to adopt, not helping those who have been adopted.
Is there also maybe a conception or misconception or where adoptive parents feel like it's personal, where they feel like if the child or the adopted child has issues with his life or his identity it's a personal failure from adoptive parents to that they might have not brought up the child well, where maybe that's not the case at all?
I think, as an adoptive parent, my experience is quite a long time ago now, but we were certainly given the impression that we were chosen because we were, going to be really good parents, and that doesn't leave you much room to move when you can see that you need help, and there weren't support services. And I think even now that's the case. When I talk to adoptive parents, their first thought is, oh my God, did I do the wrong thing? I have this child, I love this child or children, and that's very confronting for them. Whereas if we could bring parents who do adopt from the beginning to know that this is natural, that your child will want to know and have doubts, and you need to be talking about that right through their lifetime, and that of course you'll need support. This is a very special situation you're in. It would be a lot easier, but at the moment I think those two things happen. If adoptive parenting is challenged in any way, the first is, oh my God, did I do the wrong thing? And the other is, I don't know how to ask for help and I don't know where it is. So there's very few support services that there are out there who are helping adoptive parents with that, are doing a wonderful job, but they're not resourced.
Thank you very much, COLEEN. I'd like to remind everyone who's listening right now today, if you have any questions for the panelists, for the people who are discussing today, just write to asifborn2@gmail.com. So that's asifborn2@gmail.com. And if there's any questions that are relevant for anyone here, for any guest speakers, we'll answer them at the end of today's discussion. Tana, did you want to add anything to what COLEEN was saying?
Yeah, thanks, Pascal. I was actually just thinking about, just looking at my notes here, some of the things that COLEEN was saying really resonated in terms of the difficulty of feeling heard as an adoptee within a clinical setting, and there's a real need within these settings to present a strengths-based listening for your upbringing within an adoptive family. Certainly what was said around the notion of whether you've had a helpful, warm, positive family experience goes some way to ensuring positive life outcomes. But the actual loss itself is not fully understood in many instances by people in the health field, people within welfare services who are considering undertaking future adoptions. And this glossing over really impacts adoptees because there's actually a shame around expressing that you might have a consideration or a need, that your situation then isn't necessarily validated, that perhaps you're unique in and isolated in your experience of loss. And certainly the Senate report and the recent information that's come out has gone some way to acknowledge the experience of people in adoption. But it really is being perceived as a well-intentioned solution, but without the depth of support in implementation, there's a real risk to individuals who may, children who are now being adopted and into the future, if those psychological impacts aren't considered quite seriously, I think there's a lot of people going in a very short-sighted way without consideration of lifelong impacts.
Thank you very much. Dominic, you had a little different experience with adoption, being an intercountry adoptee with Asian background. How was your experience with adoption?
For me, I think adoption from in the country, it raises two fundamental areas of information. So basically, in the country adoption basically means essentially there is little to go on, if nothing at all, for the adoptive parent, and that raises a lot of questions for the adoptee. Because it's not present, the adoptive parents really don't have anywhere to go in providing information to reassure the adoptee about their place in the world. The other thing within the country adoption is particularly about race. The majority of adoptive parents are Caucasian, Anglo-Saxon, Australian from relatively middle-class white backgrounds. Their social circle and their construct of culture is quite different to the adoptee person's country of origins, and essentially the adoptive parent is trying to play catch up if they're in the frame of mind of wanting to do that. But again, most adoptive parents that I know who have adopted into country a child from overseas, they don't really have the means and also the mind space to do that. That means most of the adoptees grow up pretty much in a total vacuum of knowledge. So when an adoptee asks for, so what about my birth mother from Korea, Japan, Thailand, you know, not Japan, but Thailand or India, most of the adoptive parents just go, well, I only know what's in the file, or if they make up stuff. And in my case, my parents rightly, in an age-appropriate way, came up with certain narratives. But when I grew up a bit older and I realised that those narratives were not to be true, it created quite a disjuncture for me. So, but also when you're growing up, because you're growing up white, society itself doesn't see you as white. It sees you as the other. It sees you as Asian. So you're always on the outside of a society that you have effectively grown up in. Unless you can prove yourself through signs of being assimilated. In my case, I didn't do that. I don't play football. I don't, you know, do certain things like most Aussies tend to do. So I kind of grew up, and I actually ended up going into alcohol and other drugs as a way of trying to supplement the vacuum that most people who grew up in a family would tend to have, which is the sense of being. And yeah, so it's actually taking my trip to Vietnam and going on that journey that somehow I can fill in some of the puzzles that a person who of Asian background would take being Vietnamese as for granted as being part of the identity makeup. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for sharing your story. There is this I feel like by talking to a lot of adoptees, this necessity of knowing their narrative, where they came from, and is essential for them to know where they're going. Is that the case for all of you, intercountry and local adoptees? Isabel, perhaps.
One of the things that I would say is that there is a perception in the community that adoption is a good thing, and certainly of late in Australia there is a real push to make adoption easier, and I think there's been I can't think of any other word, but to say lazy journalism in the sense of that there is this perception that it is good. On the whole, people don't want to hear from adoptees about it, and the only experts really on adoption from an adoptee's point of view are adoptees. And I think for adoptees, and it must be worse for those adopted into country, but our whole society is based on who you look like, who you take after. And adoptees, I think, well, I describe it as it's like being separated from everybody else by a picket fence. So the adoptee is on one side of the picket fence on their own. Everybody else is on the other side of the picket fence, and you can do everything with them. All you want to do is join everybody else on the other side of the picket fence, but something holds you back. And I think that sense that it gives people of being alone and being isolated. Adoptees also have that risk of, if they talk about how they feel about being adopted, that they may very well hurt their adoptive family, and they don't want to do that because they love them. There's that risk of rejection that I think we all live with. You know, not all, but my adoptive family, I'm very close to my brother. I'm got some wonderful nieces and nephews, and I love them very dearly. But even with that, there is always this thing that's in the back of my head that if I muck up or make a mistake, I could very well be rejected. And to me, it's and I know that won't happen, but it just hangs there. And I think that's very similar for a lot of adoptees. So, for argument's sake, with my natural mother, if she said to me, and she's since died, but if she said to me, I don't want to see you again, she still remains my mother until the day she dies, because there is that biological link. But I know of adoptees who have sought a reunion with their natural parents, and their adoptive parents said, if this goes ahead, that is the finish of the relationship. And because it's a legal and not biological link, there is that view, I think, of adoptees of that's going to be the end of it. And so I think, you know, an adoptee once said to me that being adopted is one of the loneliest experiences on earth, and I tend to agree with that, in the sense of I think many adoptees have had those periods where if you reach out and you feel that nobody's there because nothing is real. But the difficulty is getting that out there and trying to change the minds of the community, and in particular right now, politicians, that adoption isn't all it's cracked up to be. But it's got nothing to do with the fact that people don't love their adoptive family or don't love their natural family. It's got to do with something much more innate, and I think that's around those things that the whole society... I mean, you can't even go to the doctor without the doctor saying, is there a history of this in your family? And if you're an adoptee, you've got to say, I don't know, I'm adopted. And so you can't escape that, those issues. And I think, you know, when you meet your natural family, and that might go well, whenever you go to a family function, there's that sense of, I can never catch up, because a whole pile of things have gone before me. With the adoptive family, when you go to family functions and you see people are related and things like that, and nobody says to you, oh, you take after so-and-so. And so adoptees have to live with those sorts of things, and I think that can be very difficult. The challenge is, I think, is trying to educate the community and politicians that you do have to listen to adoptees and their experiences if we're ever going to have legislation that is actually respectful of children. I mean, we talk about children coming first. In my view, at the moment, they're not. We're pushing for adoption without any genuine consideration of the expertise and opinions of adoptees. If the opinions of adoptees don't fit in with the high-profile adoptive parents, then what they do is try and shoot us and say, you know, we're ungrateful, or we're a rabid group, and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Isabel. That's very good points that that kind of explains why we don't hear adoptees talking about in mainstream media, and why they're not represented in how we form legislation and how we're leading care. Tania, you wanted to add quickly something about...
Yeah, thank you. Just that lovely expression that Isabel had around the picket fence, and I've identified with that as feeling stuck behind glass, and just this sense that there's always a lot of effort in maintaining the relationship, with either of, for me, I've met my birth family and I'm quite well connected with them, and also with adoptive family. That sense that no matter which environment I'm in, whichever of my family that I'm with, there is a lot of effort in maintaining a sense of connection, a sense of place. Where do I fit here? Am I welcome? If I do something wrong, will I be rejected? It does take up a lot of psychological energy, and it's not for want of trying from every party. It's exhausting. And I can really see that this is a psychological isolation that many adoptees feel. And that's even in situations where it's perceived to be a good adoption. So, and this sense that we can't speak up about that because we don't want to upset those who've made this decision on our behalf. For our mothers, our birth mothers, we don't actually want to upset them or aggrieve them that, hey, this hasn't necessarily worked out easily. And for our adoptive parents, there's so much discussion in childhood around the notion of, well, aren't you so lucky that you came to that family? Or, that there's a sense that we must be grateful, or that we need to present as grateful and well settled. So everyone else's psychological well-being is at stake if we speak up about our needs. And at the same time, there is a lot of grief and loss, and that extends to the next generation, to our children as well. I know my children say at times, gee, Mum, I really don't know your family very well, and everyone keeps a polite distance even though they're connected in a way, because these themes are very challenging to explore openly and to get through the other side to a real bonding and closeness.
Thank you very much, Tanya. You had a good let's say good relationship with your adoptive parents. Did you, or not? And did you find it difficult on a personal level to be critical? And did it take time to become critical?
I feel a little guilty that I've actually been quite critical. I'm more of an open person, so I've probably shared my thoughts in ways that haven't always been tactful. And I've always been appreciative of them, and at the same time I've felt I've needed to be appreciative of them in ways that if you were born to a family, well, they're your family, and so that's not such a consideration in the same way. It's a slightly different consideration. I certainly did have a lovely upbringing, very suburban and stable, and didn't want for anything, but there's no denying a different psychological fit, genetic fit with birth family, and yet it's as though the commitment of being family is actually more present with the adoptive family. And I know that when the chips are down, they are the people there for me, whereas with birth family, I feel a little bit like a novelty that is wheeled in and out at different times. So that's an awkward thing to say, but I'm more likely at events with the birth family to have comments about, gee, you really look like so-and-so, or isn't it lovely that you're together? And there's sort of a pressure to make it perfect now that we're all connected. So, and those are very well-intended comments from people on the outside, such as aunt or uncle figures that you might connect with once or twice a year, but it's ever present. Nothing ever gets to a point of normal.
Thank you very much. Pardon me. Ron, did you want to add anything onto this? Does that resonate to you?
Yes. Again, I'm experientially. When I came to this country, I was adopted into a white Scottish family. When I came here, they had a white Australia policy in operation, and I went to a school of 1,000 white kids, and I was the only ethnic for the first 2 or 3 years. And I think that sense of not belonging and loneliness was exacerbated in that situation. But I've always had that feeling, and I still, even today, still have that feeling that I'm apart from others, as the others have described there, the picket fence or the glass. And in my experience growing up adopted, my adopted parents were decent people, but I struggled a lot with my adoptive mother, and we had a really fractured relationship. And in that mix too, I was sexually abused by my adoptive uncle. And along with the racism I was experiencing at school, I was a complete mess by the time I was in my mid-teens. And, you know, I had constant feelings of loneliness, constant feelings of self-pity, and it's me against the world. And I lived that out right through up until the age of 39, and I became a full-fledged alcoholic and a drug addict. And, you know, I was indulging in all sorts of behaviours that, you know, and I can now look back and see as there were coping mechanisms, not very good ones, but I was coping with life the best way that I could. And I, I've often pondered what is it that happens to an adoptee that gives them the life that they lead. And to me, I remember reading a book by Nancy Berrier, the Primal Wounds, and I've read, I'm widely read in adoption books now, but that book had particular resonance for me because she talked about a psychic wounding taking place to the infant, one that they never ever can recover from fully, but yet one that can be managed and its impact on the adoptee's life can be managed. And I've taken that and when I stopped drinking, which was 15 years ago now, and taking drugs, I'd spent my whole life up to that point not even acknowledging that my problems were because I was adopted. I was in denial. I was completely fooling myself. And when I got sober, you know, I said to myself, I've got to deal with these issues that I've tried to bury for all these years. And I then, you know, I sought help with the medical profession, and I started to talk to them about what it was like to grow up adopted and the feelings of loneliness, the feelings of rejection, the constant wondering, why didn't my mother keep me? Why did she abandon me? What is wrong with me that she didn't want me? Like another has shared, I found my birth parents, and I've had a very interesting experience in finding them because my connection with my birth mother hasn't gone very well, ironically because she's an alcoholic. But my connection with my birth father has gone really, really well. And although he lives in the UK, so I don't get to see him very often, but I go every 2 years to stay with him and my family there. But you know, the last speaker was talking about being a performer, if you like. That's not a complete quote what was said, but I feel like I'm putting on a performance, and I've got to make the efforts to fit in and that type of stuff. And you know, I think the word used was novelty too. I've always had that feeling, but I just accept that that's the way I am. That I'm never going to feel completely at ease wherever I am. I think there's a certain hypervigilance that comes to the adoptee, maybe from the beginning of life itself, and it remains with us all of our lives. But you know, I endeavour to manage it so it's not dominating my life.
Sorry, my microphone was muted. Thank you very much, Ron, for sharing this very personal experience. I'd like to say here that in adoption, it's privatization of out-of-home care, and in your case, where abuse has occurred, there was a lack of accountability or loss of accountability by the state, and to prevent such thing from happening, and perhaps maybe you would have been able to have following in another type of care where yeah, the state would have continuous responsibility over you. I'd like to move on to the next question. Adopted persons have their birth certificate changed. Their parents' names and sometimes their own are erased. Then they are made as if born to other individuals. What does the change in birth certificate mean to you? So either on a personal level or either on a more critical level. Dom, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, I like to birth certificates for me personally is really a no-go sort of issue. Mainly because the circumstances of my adoption was that I came out of an orphanage. Vietnam does not do birth certificates until quite recently, in the last 15 years or so. So I allocated a birth certificate by the Australian government, the death, birth and marriages in South Australia. So, but on saying that, I think recently in the last 15 years, particularly in Australia, and certain countries where the birth certificate is allocated to the adopted to the child to be adopted, and the fact that legally on some grounds in some receiving countries, the requirement is that the child needs to have the birth parents erased off that birth certificate in order to become adopted. At the moment, there's some legal sort of thing going on with the adoption in Australia, where prospective adoptive parents are erring on the side of actually going in towards that direction, where they would prefer, before the child comes to Australia, they will be given a clean slate birth certificate and citizenship, which kind of erases anything to do with the birth country or birth family. Now, children adopted from overseas generally do come into orphanages. In most cases, most of those orphans are actually not orphans. They do have a relative, or they may have been relinquished due to certain circumstances, which has quite striking similarities to forced adoptions in Australia early on, in the last 60s, in the 60s and 70s. So, birth parents in those countries such as Korea, there's a strong emphasis on the birth certificate, and that has impacted on how adoptees, when they return looking for information. I think that's where for my cohort, birth certificate is really important. It's a statement that there is a possibility of being able to reconnect with the birth family in your from the sending country. So it's kind of birth certificates. I think is quite a interesting one, because for the adoptee, it's evidence of proof. For the adopted parent, it's more about what adoption is, which is kinning someone from outside the family into your family. And I think the adopted parents of my generation were really sympathetic to for the child needing to have some kind of connection. So what they did was that they would maintain certain elements of the name that came with documentation from the sending country into your new name that you have when you become adopted. So and generally speaking, that tends to be the middle name. So nowadays, I think the pendulum is swinging more towards the idea that when you take someone from an institution or from a sending country, there's a real sense of needing to capture it within the culture today, where adoption is about the forever family. It's about encapsulating an idea that we have not control, but essentially that's what it is. We own this child, this person, and so I think there needs to be more room for discussion around how birth certificates from birth countries is preserved somewhat in how we adapt it towards birth certificates that we give to children from overseas in Australia.
Thank you very much, Dom. Yeah, there's certainly that's a really important question, I think, and probably the core of this discussion is maybe rethink ways to keep that birth certificate, but still transfer parenting rights and caring rights to someone else that is more apt to care for the child without having to, in the perspective of the child, to have to modify his or her identity. Colleen, you were an adoptive parent, and did you ever think about the consequences of adopting in the terms of birth certificate change? Did you ever think that that might have been a problem for your adoptive children?
I think we didn't in my time. We thought we were doing a good thing and didn't think about these matters much at all. But in my experience at VANISH, I think there's hardly anybody, even if they know they're adopted, for whom it isn't an enormous shock when they first see their original birth certificate. It's like as if everything that they have wondered about and been concerned about is suddenly made manifest. That you have a piece of paper that has the names of other people on it who actually were your born parents, and for many people they see that another name was chosen for them, and it's a moment of huge shock of bringing into relief all those things you've wondered about. And certainly at VANISH our belief is that the absolute starting point for any person should be a completely true, transparent, honest birth certificate for everybody. That, you know, is a birthright. And I think it's also thrown into stark relief now when children can be born of donor conception or assisted reproductive technologies. So birth certificate may need a lot of information on it, but one of the things we're campaigning for from VANISH is that that is an absolute birthright, to have that information and for it to be known to the child. Now, I guess when a child is adopted, even with open adoption, still a lot falls on the adoptive parent to make sure that information is available. And one will hope that it would be from now on, from the beginning and all through life, which draws into focus, well, would some people want to have an integrated birth certificate with the issues of their adoption, or would some people want to have two certificates? And as we look at our Adoption Act here, that's going to be a matter for consultation. But we do have examples of people learning from the bureaucracy that they're adopted, because they can see some little a schedule on the certificate that tells them that. So there have been awful instances of finding out by the bureaucracy, or also finding out incorrect or insufficient information, and then coming to get the birth certificate and then realizing that that's only the beginning of the story, that you then have to go and get records to find out who you really are. And that feels to most people quite shocking, and it also makes most people quite angry and quite sad that they should have to go on a search for their identity, and that government should still have those records and in some cases control what they're given. So that feeling of somebody else being in control of your information and your ability to then search and contact your parents is just plainly wrong. People's birth identity and their ability to make contact with their mother and father and any other family they might have should be as open and transparent and as easy as possible. And the only times when, you know, children need to be protected is if that's not safe. And in other instances where it's not safe, we have supervised contact. So there's really not any excuse for that information not being readily available, complete and accurate, and leading to the ability to contact safely.
Thank you very much, Colleen. There's this one expression you just used that really resonated with me, and I by speaking with people, friends of mine that do want to adopt, you said who you really are, and in a lot of people who think of adopting think that the biological identity of someone is not very relevant, or it doesn't mean much to anyone. Can any adoptee talk about this? How that biological identity is important to them, or is it important at all?
I'd be happy
Perhaps
to talk about
Tanya.
that, Pascal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
So I know that I was adopted in 1977, and in that time, the theory of children being a blank slate that you imprint good values upon for them to become a good human being, kind of that was the prevalent literature around child development. And so there was less of an understanding, I think, at the time around the genetic, psychological personality of a person. And it was perceived that you either parented well and a child turned out well, or you didn't parent so well and it. So there was a lot of pressure on parents, I think, to get that right. And so consequently, I think that has an impact growing up as an adoptee for me. Just this feeling of being advised that I needed to shift my ways to their ways because their approach or their style of personality was a better one or a better way to live life. And I've forgotten the question.
Yeah, the
Does that
question is,
answer? Yeah.
yeah, that does answer
Yeah.
the importance of biological identity
Yeah.
to within your identity. But I do want to move on to this next question. I hear that often adoptees suffer from abandonment issues, and I'd like to know if that happened with all of you, and how did it manifest throughout your life. So Tanya, did you want to answer that one?
Sure. I can remember from a very, very young age, reading books like Are You My Mother in the school library. So there was certainly always a curiosity around identity and who am I? What is this experience that's happened to me? So I was very grateful to find out quite young that I was an adoptee. Uh, just like Ron expressed around the teen years, I also faced a lot of challenges around, well, do I belong? Am I really cared for by my friends? Why are social things so difficult? I would really question my place and I suppose how appreciated I was by others, my sense of place in the world. And I think the abandonment issues in adulthood have really come through searching for an ideal relationship with which to experience this bond that other people have in family life and not particularly successfully. So attachment, I think the difficulty is really that our lives have begun with a loss, an unacknowledged loss, and a loss that everyone else described as being a happy occasion. So isn't it great that you've been adopted into a lovely family? Well, yes, it is, but it's not until you're an adult that you can unpack that and realize that it's actually shaped some of our instinctive responses to connection. And I know that I can be a very sociable and affable person on a surface level, but to allow people to really come close to me takes considerable effort and trust, and actually even understanding how to trust and what it is to allow people into oneself in a close way doesn't come very easily if those bonding experiences haven't happened in the way it has for most other people.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Ron, you also experienced abandonment issues. How did that manifest throughout your life?
Okay, well, first of all, I'd just like to say that I really appreciate what Tanya just had to say. Uh, I've I've seen the impact of the abandonment work itself out in my life in one particular way, and that is in my inability to have sustained relationships. And look, I've been, and I'm going to be quite frank here, I've been married 3 times. I'm on my 4th marriage. I've had several dozen other failed relationships of varying lengths with women. And I can see now my behavior in those relationships I couldn't at the time because I always had what I describe as a victim mentality. You know, what they did to me, what she's of this, she there or that. Why didn't my mother love me? All this stuff was going percolating around in my psyche in my head all the time. And I was unable to trust another human being. I was unable to love other people. I equated love with sex for most of my life, and it's only in my later years that, with counselling and with mixing with other adoptees, with reading about the impact of adoption upon me, that I've begun to settle down. And I can say now that, I'm a much more settled person in my relationship with my wife. Uh, I'm sure if I was able to present my ex-wives now, they would describe someone who was juvenile, who was very self-centered, very selfish, untrusting, unfaithful. In every which way, I was a bad partner to all the people I was in relationship with, and I can see now why. It wasn't that I was a bad person, but I was dealing with a situation, or rather the situation was dealing with me, and I just couldn't cope. In fact, I couldn't cope. That's why I got into drugs and alcohol, and it was just too painful for me. And as I mentioned before, I suppressed all this stuff until I got sober and then realised how it had been affecting my life. And since I've gotten sober, and I've been dealing with my adoption issues, I've settled down a great deal, and I'm a much calmer person now. I believe I'm very, very capable of loving people now, and I wasn't before. I didn't even come close to real love. But today, I've changed, but it hasn't been easy. And as I mentioned before, I think that this psychic wounding that took place when I was put in an orphanage, it'll remain with me for the rest of my days. No one can erase it with acts of love or with a clever book or a clever word. It will always be there, but I don't choose to be dominated by it anymore. Thank you.
I would like to make a small point about that. I think one of the primary things that adoptive parents, they tend to focus on what's called attachment and abandonment. That they're trying to address abandonment with attachment theory. And one of the problems with this is that, especially when it comes to intercountry adoption, is that they're trying to do one thing, which is the attachment of the child to the adoptive parent, as though that is going to be the solution to dealing with behavioural issues that are seen in the adoptee. While they're trying to struggle, and because they don't understand or don't know that the adoptee's feelings of abandonment really comes back down to not understanding or not knowing the circumstances of why they were put into an orphanage or a baby's home. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Dom. We're coming close to an hour, so I'd like to remind people that are listening to this panel at the moment, if you have any questions for the panelists, just write to me at asifborn2@gmail.com and we'll answer to your questions. I'd like to move on to the next question, which is, do you have a message for younger adoptees for them to understand better on their own adoption and perhaps develop a bit more critical thinking, or perhaps feel a bit more free to think and talk about adoption and figure out how they feel? Perhaps they're not alone feeling those feelings. Do you have any message for the adoptee, for younger adoptees? So Ron, so Tania, just quickly.
Okay. If there are younger adoptees listening to this, and I believe that there are, then my advice to you would be that you go and seek help, that you join an adoption support group, that you speak to psychologists or psychiatrists or your doctor, that you read about adoption, that you network with other adoptees. Don't try and deal with this in isolation. This is not an easy thing to deal with, the being abandoned and then being adopted. It's taken me a lifetime. I don't think it has to take others a lifetime. I'm a bit of a slow learner. But please go and seek help and let people know how you're feeling, and tell your friends and your family what the impacts are on you. Your opinions are valid.
My microphone was muted. Thank you very much, Ron. Tanya, did you have anything else to add? Would you like to give a message to the younger adoptees out there?
Just as Ron was just saying, really just be patient with the process. It's so hard in the throes of, I think, when you're in your younger years and it's hard to make sense of, and that might be a time where you're searching for information about family. It might be, you're feeling quite stuck in your family dynamics within your adoptive family. Be patient that it all will come together at some point, and it's a lifelong process. So I think it's important to also take the time to just enjoy the moment, be with good friends, enjoy the things that you can enjoy, because it can so easily take over your whole life experience. And it's a huge part of who we are as adoptees. But take a rest from it, take care of yourself through that journey as well.
Thanks. COLEEN, you have dealt with a lot of adoptive parents and adoptees and mothers who lost their children to adoption. What would be your message for younger adoptees?
I think that whatever you're feeling and experiencing in any of those roles is highly valid for you. That what the myths out there, or even what experts out there, that's all information, but your feelings and your experience are your own, and you have a right to them, and you have a right to have other people listen to them with understanding and without judgment. And if that can't happen within your family, then maybe it can happen with trusted friends or with good professionals, but sometimes you have to keep seeking till you find those. But I think to be true to yourself, and also to know that adoption's not something you need to be grateful for or to get over, but it's something that you live with, that is part of your experience. And I think to be aware of, people like the people on this panel and the zillions of people out there who were adopted, who live absolutely fantastic and wonderful lives. And I think if it gives people anything, it gives them a flexibility and a resilience, because they have to cope with all that internal dialogue that can be seen as a very special strength, and to be brave enough really to embrace that uniqueness. And I think to also not make it one's whole life, because there's flexibility and resilience and learned experience because of being adopted, but there's also all those myriad of wonderful other gifts that people have got. And I think, take time to let the adoption experience fall away and just be who you are, and move forward, because it is challenging not to make traumatic experiences the defining feature of one's life. And I think by its nature, adoption is initially traumatic, but you're more than that and enjoy the rest of who you are.
Thank you very much, COLEEN. Isabel, what would be your suggestions and message for younger adoptees?
I think one of the most therapeutic things I've ever done is to hang around with other adoptees. And, I've spent years in therapy and didn't find it all that helpful. But when you sit in a room with other adoptees, like I did for many years at VANISH, and adoptees can actually finish off your sentences, because there's such a commonality about what we think and what we feel. I think those things can be very therapeutic. And as somebody once said to me, I walk on your side of the picket fence. And I think there's I don't want to be flippant here, but there should be an adoptee club. And to my mind, I remember advocating once for a young boy who was adopted, who'd attempted suicide, and I sat down with him and I said to him, I'm adopted too, and I want you to know that when I'm an old lady sitting in a nursing home somewhere, if you need to talk, you can always come to me, because from my point of view, there is a bond between adopted people. and that's the message that I'd give to young people now who are struggling, is to contact your local adoption support agency like VANISH, and get in there and sit down with other adoptees and share your views, and you will find that you're not so much alone, that many of the things that you think and feel are quite normal for adoptees. I guess the other message I'd have is, don't have any expectations that it's going to go away. You know, I think, oh well, you know, I've worked through it, I've done, you know, I've done the work and it's fine, and then without being critical of watching television and seeing Deborah Lee Finesse on the television advocating for adoption was one of the things that made me realise that I'm actually not over it at all. So don't have any expectations. You take care of yourself. You have the rest when you need to, and it is, to my mind, very safe to share your most inner feelings with other adoptees. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabel. Dominic, what will be your message to adoptees, younger adoptees?
For younger adopters, I would say try to break it down with the adoptive, your parents, as parents, and try and get them to kind of come to some sort of basis of understanding, that a level of discussion that can be had without feeling that either side needs to put up the defensive or feel threatened. I would actually say that adoption is actually a lifelong journey, and what I experienced as an 8-year-old when I questioned my mum is quite different to how I look at adoption today. For me today, it's more about determining possibilities of finding family, but not really expecting that I will, knowing that there's a 3% chance that adoptees from overseas can connect with their birth family. So it's understanding that things happen in life that can make you actually find your way through the adoption maze, so to speak, in a way that can be self-fulfilling to your own identity.
Thank you very much, Don. I'd like to read a little poem by this poet called Khalil Gibran, and I think it will be really it's relevant in this case of talking about adoptees and non-adoptive people as well. So here it goes. Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts. For they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you, for life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. So this is a poem that actually a friend of mine from Lebanon tells me that during baptism they say to the parents of the children. Do you have any reactions or thoughts about this poem? Perhaps I would like to ask COLEEN if you have any thoughts about such kind of philosophy.
I think it's very moving, and I think it makes one want to reflect, and I think that there's a sacredness in birth and a tie that we seek to break at our peril, but I think there is also a sacredness in the gift of being able to openly and honestly parent a child who needs that parenting. But basically, we don't own anyone, but everyone's entitled to their own identity and their own place in the world, and we need to be there for each other in the most honest way that we can.
Thank you very much, Colleen. On this note, I'd like to finish this and conclude this panel. I'd like to thank every panelist that have participated tonight, today, and have shared their very personal stories. And I hope that people and adoptees that are listening can empathize on those experiences, respect those experiences, and perhaps give more space to adoptees that have more experiences in critical thinking on their own adoption. I'd also like to thank Linnell Long that put me in contact with some of the panelists tonight, and William Hammersley for his ongoing help to organize these panels. I'd like to also thank my technician, sitting on my left, Mark Reynolds, who's helping me on changing cameras. And I hope that everyone is enjoying these panels. I'll come back for the next panel next month. Thank you very much, and goodbye.